My name is Kira Wallace. I'm 32 years old, a sergeant in the United States Army. I've faced enemy fire, but nothing prepared me for the attack from my own family. Standing in my mother-in-law's living room, a positive pregnancy test hidden in my pocket, I was confronted with a different piece of paper. A forged DNA test. My brother-in-law, Nick, held out with a smug grin. Then my husband, Kevin, the man I loved, walked up and spat in my face. The stinging slap from my mother-in-law that followed didn't hurt as much as my sisters-in-law, Nora and Audrey, dragging me out by my hair like an animal, throwing me onto the damp lawn while the neighbors stared. Kevin just stood there, silent. They thought they had destroyed me. They had no idea they'd just given me a new mission, a war I was determined to win. If you've ever been betrayed and humiliated by the very people you loved most, let me know where you're watching from. Hit like and subscribe, because this is the story of how a soldier fought not for revenge, but to build a fortress no liar could ever breach. The drive from Fort Lewis was always a decompression chamber for me. The uniform came off, but the mindset of a soldier remained until I saw the familiar turn onto our street. Tonight, though, the discipline felt different. It was a shield, holding in a secret so fragile and so powerful I thought it might burst right out of me. My right hand left the steering wheel, resting unconsciously over the flat plane of my stomach. A tiny, impossible life was growing there. Our life. I could already see Kevin's face, the way his blue eyes would widen, the initial shock giving way to a slow, brilliant smile that always reached them last. He'd lift me up, spinning me around in the kitchen, and all the quiet aches of wanting a family would finally dissolve. To celebrate, I'd stopped at the commissary and bought everything for his favorite meal, chicken parmesan. A real home-cooked meal, not something heated up from a box. It was a declaration of love made of breadcrumbs, melted mozzarella, and slow-simmered marinara sauce. As I pulled into the driveway, I noticed my mother-in-law Brittany's sedan and Nora's minivan parked at the curb. A full house, a little unusual for a Tuesday, but maybe they'd sensed good news was in the air. The thought made me smile. Maybe I could tell them all at once. I pushed open the front door, the aroma of my pre-prepped sauce filling the air. "Honey, I'm home," I called out, a bag of groceries in my arm. The silence that answered was immediate and absolute. It wasn't an empty house silence. It was a heavy, watchful silence. The air, which should have been warm and welcoming, was as cold as a morgue. I walked into the living room and froze. They were all there. Brittany, my mother-in-law, sat perfectly upright in the center of the sofa, her hands clasped in her lap. Kevin's sisters, Nora and Audrey, were perched on the armchairs like vultures. And his brother, Nick, leaned against the mantelpiece, a piece of paper in his hand. They were all looking at me. Not with welcome, but with a cold, unified judgment that made the hair on my arms stand up. It was an ambush, a tribunal, and I was the one on trial. My military training kicked in, cataloging threats, the rigid posture of my mother-in-law, the barely suppressed sneers on his sisters' faces, the unnatural stillness of my husband, Kevin, who stood by the window, refusing to meet my eyes. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice sounding small in the oppressive quiet. Nick pushed himself off the mantelpiece, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. He had a look of sickly triumph in his eyes, a look I'd seen before when he'd managed to twist a situation to his advantage. "We know, Kira," he said, his voice smooth as oil. He held up the paper. "We know everything." He placed the document on the coffee table. I saw the letterhead of a medical lab, columns of numbers, and a conclusion highlighted in yellow. A DNA test. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. A DNA test for what? Nick began to speak, weaving a story so fluid it was clear he'd rehearsed it. He talked about a party a few months back, a night I'd had 2 beers and felt a little tired. He painted a picture of me, a lonely soldier's wife, supposedly confiding in him, hinting at my unhappiness. He claimed I'd come on to him, that I was desperate for attention while Kevin was away on a business trip. He said he'd rejected me, of course, out of loyalty to his brother. But now, he said with a sigh of feigned regret, the consequences were clear. It was a lie, a complete and utter fabrication. He had cornered me that night, his breath stinking of whiskey, and whispered disgusting things in my ear. I had pushed him away and told him to get lost. This was his revenge. I knew it, Brittany's voice cut through the air, sharp and brittle. I told you, Kevin. A woman who spends all her time in the army, surrounded by men, how could she be faithful? It's not in her nature. Her words weren't just an accusation. They were an assassination of my character, an attack on the uniform I wore with pride. Every grueling training exercise, every sacrifice, every ounce of discipline I'd built was being twisted into something sordid and cheap. My eyes flew to Kevin. He was my husband, my partner. He knew me. He had to know this was insane. I searched his face, begging silently for a sign, a flicker of doubt, a shred of the trust we had built. But there was nothing. His eyes were hollow, empty vessels where love used to be. He took a step toward me, then another. For a wild, desperate second, I thought he was coming to defend me, to wrap his arms around me and tell them all to go to hell. Instead, he stopped a foot in front of me, his face a mask of disgust. He drew in a sharp breath, and he spat directly in my face. The warm, viscous liquid hit my cheek and dripped down my chin. The world stopped. The air left my lungs. That single vile act was more brutal than any punch. It wasn't just contempt. It was a final, soul-crushing declaration. You are no longer my wife. You are nothing. From the armchairs, a sound trickled out, the cruel, delighted giggles of Nora and Audrey. They were enjoying this. They were feasting on my destruction. The shock held me frozen, a statue of humiliation. Then, a blur of motion from the couch. Brittany was on her feet, her face contorted with rage. Her hand swung through the air, and the crack of it hitting my cheek echoed in the silent room. The slap was sharp and hot, snapping my head to the side, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shrapnel tearing through my heart. Before I could even react, Nora and Audrey were on me. They moved like a pack of hungry animals, grabbing my arms, my hair. A sharp, searing pain exploded in my scalp as they yanked my head back. I was a soldier, trained in hand-to-hand combat. I could have dropped them both in seconds, but I didn't. I couldn't. My body, my training, my very will to fight had been obliterated by the man who was supposed to be my safe harbor. My limbs were lead. My mind was a white void of static. They dragged me, stumbling, through the living room I had helped paint, past the wedding photos on the wall, and toward the front door. I felt like an animal being hauled to the slaughter, my boots scraping against the hardwood floors. They wrenched the door open, exposing me to the fading light of the evening and the curious eyes of our neighbors across the street. With a final, coordinated shove, they threw me out. I landed hard on the damp, cold lawn, the shock of the impact rattling my bones. The cool, wet grass soaked through my jeans, a miserable, chilling finality. I looked up just in time to see Kevin standing in the doorway, his face unreadable. His voice, devoid of all emotion, drifted out to me. Don't ever come back here. The door slammed shut. The click of the deadbolt was the sound of my life breaking in two. I lay there on the cold ground, the sting on my cheek fading, the shame a burning fire in my gut. I looked at the house, at the warm yellow light glowing from the living room window. That light used to be a beacon of family, of love, of home. Now, it was just the light from a prison of liars, and I realized this wasn't the beginning of the battle. This was just the culmination of a war that had been brewing for a long time. For how long I lay on that wet lawn, I don't know. Time seemed to stretch and warp. The world had narrowed to the feeling of cold seeping into my bones and the rhythmic flashing of a neighbor's porch light. My cheek still throbbed, a dull, aching reminder of Brittany's hand. But the physical pain was a distant echo. The real wound was deeper, a gaping chasm inside my chest where my life used to be. The shock that had paralyzed me was beginning to recede, and in its place, a flood of memories rushed in, each one a small, sharp piece of glass explaining how I'd ended up here. That warm, yellow light from the window. It wasn't just a prison tonight. It had always been. I had just been too determined to see it as a home. The attack tonight wasn't a sudden storm. It was a hurricane that had been building strength, mile by mile, over the years. My mind drifted back to my first Thanksgiving with the Morrisons. I'd driven 12 hours straight from a field training exercise, my body aching, my mind exhausted, but my heart filled with a nervous excitement. I was going to meet the family of the man I loved. I'd arrived still in my fatigues, too short on time to change. I remember standing in the doorway, smelling the rich scents of roasting turkey and cinnamon. Brittany had looked me up and down, her eyes lingering on my combat boots. A thin, tight smile played on her lips as she spoke, her voice just loud enough for everyone in the crowded living room to hear. Well, the uniform is handsome, I'll give you that. But a wife should know her way around a turkey. A ripple of polite, knowing chuckles went through the room. I felt my face flush with heat. I was a sergeant in the U.S. Army. I could navigate miles of hostile terrain with a compass and a map. I could field strip a rifle in the dark. But in that moment, I was reduced to my inability to perform a traditional domestic chore. Throughout dinner, I tried to join the conversation, but they spoke a language I didn't understand. It was a rapid-fire volley of small-town gossip, updates on neighbors I'd never met, stories about high school rivals I didn't know, debates about local politics I had no context for. It was a verbal wall, expertly constructed to keep me on the outside. I sat there, a guest at my own welcome party, feeling utterly and completely alone. Then came the Christmas party a year later. It was an annual tradition at their house, a huge affair with twinkling lights and eggnog. Kevin was so proud to have me on his arm. That night, I met Amy, his high school sweetheart. She was exactly what you'd picture, sweet, blonde, a kindergarten teacher who everyone just adored. Brittany hugged her like a long-lost daughter. Later, as I was standing by the dessert table, Nora, Kevin's older sister, came up beside me. She picked up a slice of pumpkin pie, took a bite, and sighed dramatically. You know, she said, looking right at me, Amy used to make the most incredible pumpkin pie, from scratch. She was just the perfect homemaker type. The implication hung in the air, thick and suffocating, and you are not. I just smiled and endured it, that tight, polite smile that becomes a soldier's best camouflage in social situations. But inside, I felt myself shrink. I was a stranger in my own life, constantly being measured against a ghost, a version of a woman I could never be and never wanted to be. I was a soldier. They saw it as a flaw. And Nick? The memory of that party, the one he'd twisted into his poisonous lie, came back with horrifying clarity. He'd found me in the kitchen while I was getting a glass of water. He'd leaned in close, his voice a low, suggestive whisper. Must get lonely, being a soldier girl like you, he'd murmured, his hand brushing my arm. I could help with that. The revulsion was instant. I pulled away, my voice cold and hard. Get lost, Nick. For a split second, the charming facade dropped, and I saw something ugly in his eyes, a flash of raw, entitled fury. The hatred was so potent, it was almost shocking. Then he smiled, a slow, venomous curl of his lips. You'll regret that, he'd said, his tone light, as if it were a joke. At the time, I dismissed it as the pathetic rambling of a drunk, entitled man. But now, lying on the cold grass, his words echoed in my mind like a curse that had finally come to fruition. He had made me regret it. He had taken his petty grievance and used it to detonate my entire world. The most painful memory of all, however, was the one that was quietest. It was the memory of all the times I had tried to talk to Kevin. After that first Thanksgiving, after that Christmas party, after a dozen other small cuts and slights, I would lie in bed next to him and try to explain how I felt. Your mom, your sisters, they make me feel like I don't belong, I'd say, my voice tentative, afraid of sounding weak. It's like I'm always failing some test I didn't know I was taking. And every time, he'd roll over, his back to me, and offer the same placating, dismissive words. You're being too sensitive, Kira. That's just how they are. Mom and the girls are just joking. They only want what's best for us. He never saw it. Or maybe he refused to see it. He chose their comfort over my pain, every single time. He asked me to absorb the blows, to be the bigger person, to understand their way. He failed to be my shield. He failed to stand by me, to draw a line in the sand and say, "This is my wife, you will respect her." That failure, that quiet, consistent refusal to be my partner, had planted the seeds of tonight's betrayal. Nick may have supplied the lie, but Kevin's inaction had tilled the soil and watered the ground for it to grow. He had let them poison our marriage long before Nick ever handed him that piece of paper. If you've ever been made to feel like an outsider by your own family, or if you've ever had your feelings dismissed as being too sensitive, please support my story by hitting the like button and let me know in the comments by simply writing, "I understand." Your support means more than you know. A car drove by, its headlights sweeping over me, and the spell of the past was broken. I scrambled to my feet, my body stiff and cold. I couldn't stay here. Wiping the tear tracks and the disgusting residue from my face with the back of my sleeve, I walked to my car, got in, and locked the doors. The engine turned over with a reassuring rumble. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. I drove aimlessly for a few minutes before my internal compass took over, guiding me back toward the only place that felt like solid ground. I parked in a visitor spot overlooking the entrance to Fort Lewis. The flag was illuminated, flying proudly against the night sky. I fought for this country. I trained. I bled. I swore an oath to protect it. So why couldn't I fight for my own home? The answer hit me with the force of a physical blow. Because it was never my home. It was theirs. I was just a temporary guest, an outsider they had tolerated until they found a reason not to. So, where do I go now? The question hung in the silence of my car, heavy and suffocating. Where do I go now? My mind was a blizzard of pain and confusion, but through the storm, one instinct remained clear, honed by years of training. When under fire, you don't panic. You move to a secure location. I didn't drive back to the empty, silent barracks. Instead, I drove to the 24-hour gym on base. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant and sweat. It was a place of discipline, of singular focus. It was the only place I could think of that felt safe. I walked into the women's locker room, empty at this late hour, and went straight to the showers. There were no tears. Tears were a luxury I couldn't afford. My movements were methodical, efficient. I turned the water on as hot as I could stand it and scrubbed my skin until it was raw, trying to wash away not just the dirt from the lawn, but the filth of Kevin's spit, the phantom touch of their hands on my body, the suffocating stench of their betrayal. When I was done, I stood in front of the long mirror, water dripping from my hair onto the cold tile floor. I looked at my reflection. The woman staring back wasn't a rejected wife. Her face was pale and her eyes were haunted, but behind the shock, there was something else, something hard and familiar. I saw the set of her jaw, the straight line of her spine. I didn't see a victim, I saw a soldier. And a soldier knows what to do when their position has been compromised. You don't launch a pointless counter-assault. You execute a strategic withdrawal. I gave myself an order, my voice a silent command in my head. Wallace. Assess the situation. Situation. Hostile environment. Support system compromised. A high-value asset must be protected. The asset wasn't me. It was the tiny, fragile life inside me. Identify the objective. Objective. Survival. Protect the asset. Formulate a plan of action. I needed to disappear. Not just from the Morrisons, but from this life. I needed a clean break. And the army, the very institution that Brittany had used to condemn me, was about to provide my escape route. The next morning, I was in the base library before the sun was up, poring over army regulations. My heart was a block of ice in my chest, but my mind was sharp, focused. And there it was, in black and white. AR 635-200, Chapter 8. Enlisted Administrative Separations, specifically the section on pregnancy. It offered me a legal, honorable way out, an early discharge. It was the only path that allowed me to vanish without being classified as a deserter. I printed the forms. I filled them out in my barracks room, my handwriting steady and precise. Each box checked, each line filled, was a deliberate step away from the woman I'd been. I wrote my name, rank, and serial number as if I were completing a mission report. detaching myself completely from the emotional gravity of what I was doing. I was excising a part of my identity, cutting away a decade of my life, but I felt nothing. Emotion was a liability I could not afford. The paperwork was submitted. The wait began. While the gears of military bureaucracy turned, I started my own operation, Operation Erase. I went to the bank on post and closed our joint savings account, withdrawing my half of the money in cash. I called the phone company and had my name removed from the family plan, setting up a new, individual account. Each action was a clean, decisive cut of the ties that bound me to Kevin. Back in my room, I packed. It was shockingly easy. My life with him fit into a single duffel bag. I took my uniforms, my personal documents, a few books. I sorted through the small box of keepsakes, a photo of us smiling at Pike Place Market in Seattle. I tore it in half and threw it in the trash, a silly keychain he'd won for me at the Puyallup Fair. Trash. A dried rose from our first anniversary. Trash. The only thing I kept was a small grainy image, a black and white photo from my first ultrasound a week ago. A tiny flicker of light in a world of darkness. I tucked it safely into my wallet. It was the only part of my past that had a future. A few days later, I was summoned to my commanding officer's office. Captain Miller was a good man, tough but fair, with eyes that saw more than you wanted them to. He'd always treated me with respect, valued my work. He held my discharge papers in his hand. He didn't ask for details. He didn't pry into the suddenness of my request. He just looked at me, his gaze steady and searching. I braced myself for questions, for judgment. Instead, he leaned forward, his voice low and kind. "Sergeant," he said. And the title, spoken with such respect, almost broke me. Sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought on the battlefield. They're the ones we fight when we get home. He slid the approved papers across the desk. "Whatever your decision is, live by the soldier's code, never quit." That was it. No pity, no condescension. Just a simple acknowledgement of a struggle he couldn't see but knew was there. It was the only validation I had received from anyone in weeks, and it was a lifeline. I stood, saluted him crisply, and walked out of his office with my freedom in my hand. That night, my last night at Fort Lewis, I sat on the floor of my empty barracks room. The mattress was bare, the walls were blank. I held my phone, my thumb hovering over the only number I knew I could trust. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for the one thing I hadn't allowed myself to do yet. Feel. I dialed. She picked up on the second ring. "Claire," I whispered, and the name was a key, unlocking a dam I didn't know I'd built. The sobs came then, huge, racking sobs that tore through my body. The carefully constructed walls of the soldier crumbled, and for the first time, the abandoned wife was allowed to grieve. I gasped out the whole ugly story, the accusation, the spit, the slap, the coldness of the lawn. I cried for my broken heart, for my lost love, and for the tiny, innocent baby who was starting its life in the middle of a war zone. On the other end of the line, in Portland, Oregon, Claire just listened. She didn't interrupt with questions or useless platitudes. She just let me cry until the storm passed, leaving only exhausted, hiccuping breaths. When I was done, her voice came through the phone, not soft with pity, but sharp and clear with purpose. It was the voice of a true ally, a second-in-command taking charge. "Okay," she said, her tone resolute. "I have a spare room ready for you and your little recruit. Start driving. That's an order." "Do you copy, Sergeant?" A watery, broken laugh escaped my lips. "I copy," I whispered. The first mission was complete. It was time to call in my support. It was time to go to my real home front. The drive south on I-5 from Washington to Oregon was more than just a trip. It was a ritual cleansing. With every mile I put between myself and Fort Lewis, I felt a layer of grime sloughing off my soul. I drove through the majestic, evergreen forests of the Pacific Northwest, giant sentinels of pine and fir standing silent witness to my exodus. The sky was a vast, open canvas of blue, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I felt like I could breathe again. Halfway there, somewhere just south of Olympia, I saw a sign for a classic roadside diner. On impulse, I pulled off the highway. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and sizzling bacon. I slid into a red vinyl booth and ordered a cheeseburger and a chocolate milkshake. Simple, uncomplicated things. As I ate, I realized I hadn't tasted food in days. I'd been consuming fuel, nothing more. But this was a small, quiet act of self-care. Each mile marker I passed, each sip of the thick, cold milkshake, was a quiet declaration of my own freedom. I arrived at Claire's apartment in Portland as dusk was settling over the city. I was exhausted, my body aching from the drive, my spirit worn thin. I rang the bell and the door swung open almost immediately. Claire stood there, her red hair a messy bun on top of her head, her smile warm and unwavering. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She just opened her arms wide and I walked straight into them, burying my face in her shoulder. Her hug wasn't tentative or pitying. It was strong, solid, and absolute. It was the kind of hug that says, "I've got you. You're safe now." And in that simple embrace, I felt a sense of security that I hadn't realized I'd been starving for. The armor I had worn for years, the rigid posture of the soldier, the forced smile of the daughter-in-law, cracked and fell away. Her small apartment, with its comforting clutter of books and the lingering scent of freshly ground coffee, became my fortress. The spare bedroom was painted a soft, calming blue, with a comfortable bed and a window that looked out onto a quiet tree-lined street. It wasn't just a room, it was a sanctuary. In the days that followed, Claire became my anchor in a sea of chaos. She was practical, a logistics expert in her own right. She took me to open a new bank account, just in my name. She helped me find an OB/GYN and came with me to the first appointment. She found a flyer for LeMay's classes at the local community center and signed us both up, declaring herself my official birth coach. But more important than any of that, she listened. We'd sit for hours on her comfortable, worn-out sofa, and I would talk. I told her everything again, this time without the frantic sobs, laying out the years of small cuts and the final, brutal wound. Claire would just sit there, knitting a tiny yellow baby blanket, her presence a steady, calming force. She'd hand me a tissue when my voice would break and refill my mug with chamomile tea without me having to ask. Not once did she question my story. Not for a second did she doubt me. Her belief in me was a quiet, powerful medicine, healing wounds I didn't even know were still bleeding. One afternoon, about a month after I'd arrived, a huge package was delivered to the door. I didn't recognize the sender. Claire brought it inside with a mysterious smile. "Looks like some mail for you, Sergeant," she said. I opened the box. Inside, it was filled with baby supplies, diapers, onesies, soft blankets, and a brand new car seat. Tucked inside was a handwritten card. My vision blurred as I read the words. To Sergeant Wallace, "A soldier never fights alone. We've always got your six. Your brothers in arms." Claire had secretly reached out to a few of my old squad mates. These tough, battle-hardened soldiers had pooled their money to make sure their sergeant and her new recruit had what they needed. The tears that came this time weren't of grief, but of overwhelming gratitude. I had lost one family, but another, one forged in shared hardship and mutual respect, had just reminded me I wasn't alone. Months passed in a gentle rhythm of doctor's appointments, prenatal classes, and long walks along the Willamette River. My belly grew, and with it, a fierce, protective love I had never known. The past was a shadow, but it no longer had the power to blot out the sun. The day Henry was born, the Portland sky was a soft, gentle gray. Claire was by my side through it all, holding my hand, her voice a constant stream of encouragement. When the nurse finally placed my son into my arms, the world fell away. He was so small, so perfect. He had a shock of dark black hair and a tiny, perfect mouth. And then he opened his eyes. They were Kevin's eyes. The same deep, startling blue. For a heartbeat, the air was stolen from my lungs. The ghost of a life I'd lost was staring right back at me. The pain was a sudden, sharp intake of breath. But then, Henry's tiny hand, so fragile and new, curled around my index finger. His grip was surprisingly strong, an anchor to the present. In that moment, the past shattered. This wasn't Kevin's son. This was my son. This was Henry. And the love that washed over me was so powerful, so absolute, it was tidal. It was unconditional. This was my new mission, the most important one I would ever have. I leaned down and pressed my lips to his forehead, inhaling the sweet, clean scent of new life. "Welcome to the unit, little warrior," I whispered. Life with Henry settled into a beautiful, chaotic routine. For the first time, I felt a sense of peace. We were a team, a small but mighty unit of two, navigating the world together. Claire was our ever-present, ever-loving support system. We were building a new life, a good life. One afternoon, while Henry was napping, Claire and I were folding tiny laundry in the living room. She held up a miniature pair of socks and chuckled. "You know," she said, her eyes twinkling, "we have our own set of rules in this house now. Rule number 1. No assholes are allowed to disturb the mom and baby." I smiled, a real, genuine smile. But as I looked at my sleeping son, a flicker of unease stirred in my heart, a cold premonition that the peace we had fought so hard to build was fragile. I knew she was right. But I also knew those assholes wouldn't give up that easily. The first year of Henry's life was a sanctuary. Our small apartment in Portland was a world unto itself, governed by the gentle rhythms of feeding schedules, nap times, and the sweet, milky scent of a newborn. The trauma of the past began to feel distant, like a bad dream I was finally waking up from. I had found a part-time job doing inventory logistics for a local outdoor supply company, using my military skills in a quiet civilian context. Life was simple, peaceful, and for the first time, it was truly mine. But peace, I was about to be reminded, is not a permanent state. It's a territory that must be defended. The first sign was small, a wrong number. Claire answered her cell one afternoon, and a man with a polite, professional voice asked if he could speak to Kira Wallace. When Claire asked who was calling, the line went dead. We brushed it off. A telemarketer, maybe. But then, a week later, our elderly neighbor from down the hall, Mrs. Gable, stopped Claire in the hallway. "Dear," she said, her brow furrowed with concern, "I don't mean to pry, but there was a man around here yesterday, a well-dressed fellow in a sedan. He was asking about the young blonde woman with the baby boy." A chill, cold and sharp, went down my spine. Blonde woman. Baby boy. It was too specific to be a coincidence. The long dark shadow of the Morrison family was stretching across the miles, casting a pall over our safe little world. My carefully constructed peace began to fracture. The soldier in me reawakened. Old instincts, dormant for months, snapped back to life. I found myself scanning the street before leaving the apartment, checking the rearview mirror a little too often when I drove. Every creak of the floorboards at night, every unfamiliar car that parked on our street, sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The paranoia was a familiar, unwelcome cloak. I wasn't just a mother anymore, I was a sentinel on watch. Claire saw the change in me. She saw the tension in my shoulders, the way I flinched at sudden noises. She was furious on my behalf, her anger a fierce, protective shield. The confrontation came a few days later. Claire was loading groceries into her car in the parking lot of the complex when a man approached her. He was in his 50s, with a tidy gray suit and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as a private investigator. "I've been retained by the Morrison family," he said, his voice smooth and cloying. "Mrs. Brittany Morrison is terribly worried about her grandson. She just wants to know that he's safe." I can only imagine the look on Claire's face. Claire, who had held me while I sobbed, who had seen the raw pain of their worry. She was as much a warrior as I was, just in a different uniform. "Worried," Claire shot back, her voice dripping with ice. "She has a damn funny way of showing it. You can go back and tell your client that her methods of expressing concern are unusual and unwelcome." She slammed her trunk shut. "Tell her to get lost. Kira owes you people nothing." The investigator's professional smile faltered for a second. He handed her a business card. "If she changes her mind." Claire took the card, tore it into 2 neat pieces, and dropped it on the asphalt. "She won't." When Claire told me what happened, I felt a strange mix of gratitude for her ferocity and a rising tide of cold dread. They weren't just looking, they were closing in. That night, the nightmares came back. I was on the lawn again, the wet grass cold against my skin, the door slamming shut, the sound of their laughter echoing in my ears. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, and immediately reach for Henry's crib, needing the reassurance of his small, warm body, his soft, even breaths. My fear wasn't for myself anymore. I had survived them once, but now I had a son. A beautiful, innocent little boy with his father's eyes. The thought of them trying to get their hands on him, to poison him with their lies, to claim him as their own after what they'd done. It was a terror unlike any I had ever known. I was afraid they would try to take him from me. The final straw came the next day. It was a call from Henry's daycare. The director, a wonderful woman named Susan, sounded deeply unsettled. "Kira," she said, her voice low, "I have something strange to tell you. A man came in today inquiring about enrollment. He fit the description of the man your friend Claire mentioned seeing." My blood ran cold. "What did he do?" "Well, he took the tour," Susan continued, "but he seemed overly interested in Henry's group. I caught him trying to take a picture of Henry with his phone when he thought no one was looking. I stopped him, of course, and he made some excuse and left in a hurry. Kira, I've already filed a report with the front office, and he won't be allowed back on the premises, but I thought you needed to know immediately." I hung up the phone, my hand shaking with a rage so pure it felt like white heat. This was a violation of the most sacred kind. They had sent a stranger to invade my son's safe space, to stalk him, to treat him like an object to be photographed and reported on. They weren't looking for the truth. They weren't looking for reconciliation. They were looking for control. This was a reconnaissance mission, and I knew what came after that. When Claire got home, I told her what happened. The color drained from her face, replaced by a steely resolve. That night, she made a decision. She didn't call Kevin. She didn't call Brittany. She pulled out her phone and called a friend of hers from law school, a woman who was now a partner at a family law firm in downtown Portland. After she got off the phone, she turned to me. "We need to be prepared," she said, her voice firm. "We're not running anymore. We're going to build a firewall. If they want to fight, we'll be ready for them." She didn't know how right she was. She had no way of knowing that hundreds of miles away, in a sterile hospital room, fate was already orchestrating a drama far bigger than we could ever imagine, a twist that would change the rules of the entire war. That evening, Claire went out and came back with a new deadbolt and a small, high-definition security camera. As she installed it on the front door, I watched her, feeling a grim sense of purpose solidify within me. We were fortifying our position, reinforcing our defenses, but I knew, with the chilling certainty of a soldier on the front lines, that the best defense wasn't a lock or a camera. It was the truth. And ironically, the truth was about to be exposed in a place I never, ever would have expected. While Claire and I were fortifying our small apartment in Portland, turning it into a defensive position, the war we were preparing for was already imploding from within the enemy's own command center. We knew nothing of it. We were bracing for an attack, unaware that the core of the Morrison family was in the process of a catastrophic self-destruction hundreds of miles away in a quiet, sterile room at St. Joseph Medical Center. It had started with a cough. Nick's persistent, chest-rattling cough had worsened over a week, blossoming into a severe case of pneumonia. Now he lay in a hospital bed, tubes in his arm, an oxygen mask fogging with each ragged breath. His fever was dangerously high, pushing him into the hazy, terrifying landscape of delirium. The entire Morrison clan kept a tense vigil around his bed. Brittany sat ramrod straight in a visitor's chair, her anxiety manifesting as rigid control. Nora and Audrey hovered nearby, whispering to each other, their faces etched with worry. And Kevin? Kevin stood by the window, staring out at the gray Washington sky, looking haunted. He had aged a decade in the last year, the weight of a decision he could never undo pressing down on him. For hours, the only sounds were the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor and Nick's labored breathing. Then he began to mutter. At first, it was just unintelligible nonsense, but soon, fragments of words, names from the fever swamp of his subconscious started to break through. No. Get away, he mumbled, tossing his head on the pillow. And then, a name. Kira. A current of tension shot through the room. Brittany stiffened. Kevin turned slowly from the window, his eyes fixed on his brother. Nick's muttering grew more agitated. Forged. Fake test. Told you. His words were slurred, disjointed, but the pieces were beginning to connect in the suffocating silence of the room. Revenge. She laughed at me. Had to. Brittany's face had gone pale. He's just delirious, she said, her voice a little too sharp, a little too quick. The fever's making him talk nonsense. But no one was listening to her. All eyes were on Nick, who was now struggling against the bedsheets, his movements frantic. A nurse came in to check his vitals, her brow furrowed with concern as she noted his spiking temperature. And then, it happened. As the fever peaked, Nick suddenly bolted upright in the bed, his eyes flying open. They were wide, unseeing, and filled with a primal terror, as if he were staring down a demon only he could see. He ripped the oxygen mask from his face and screamed, his voice raw and horrifyingly clear. It was me! I did it! The heart monitor began to beep frantically. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked down on me! Nick shrieked, his wild eyes darting around the room, not seeing any of them. I forged it. I forged the damn test. The baby is Kevin's. It's Kevin's! He collapsed back onto the pillow, his chest heaving, his confession hanging in the air like poison gas. The world stopped. The frantic beeping of the monitor was the only sound in a vacuum of absolute, bone-crushing silence. It was a silence so profound you could feel the weight of it, the pressure of a truth so terrible it had shattered the very air they were breathing. Brittany's face was a mask of chalky disbelief. Nora and Audrey stared at each other, their expressions a perfect mirror of dawning horror. They were all frozen, statues in a tableau of ruin. But all the focus, all the energy in the room, converged on one person. Kevin. He stood motionless, the blood draining from his face. His expression shifted through a rapid, devastating sequence of emotions. First, stunned incomprehension. Then, a wave of sickening, dawning realization. It was followed by a surge of pure, black rage that contorted his features into something unrecognizable. And finally, beneath it all, a look of agony so profound it was almost impossible to witness. The lie he had built his righteous anger upon had just been exposed. The woman he had loved, the woman he had spat on and thrown away, was innocent. The son he had disowned, the child he had allowed a stranger to hunt, was his own flesh and blood. Every cruel word, every act of humiliation, every moment of his cold, silent complicity replayed in an instant, and the weight of it broke him. With a guttural roar of pure anguish, Kevin launched himself across the room toward the bed. What did you do? He screamed, his hands reaching for Nick's throat. Code Blue! A nurse yelled from the doorway as she and another orderly rushed in, grabbing Kevin, pulling him back from his unconscious brother. He fought against them, his rage and grief making him impossibly strong. You destroyed my life. What did you do? They finally managed to restrain him, pinning him against the far wall as he sagged, the fight draining out of him, replaced by heaving, gut-wrenching sobs. Then he slowly lifted his head, his tear-filled, broken eyes finding his mother and sisters, who were huddled together as if for protection. His voice was a raw, ragged whisper, filled with a new, terrible poison. Blame. Why? He choked out. Why did you all believe him? Why didn't any of you believe her? The question was a blade, and it sliced through the last remaining threads of their family alliance. The accusation hung between them, undeniable and unforgivable. In that moment, the foundation of the Morrison family cracked, and the bitter poison of blame and hatred began to seep in, tearing them apart from the inside out. The truth always has a way of coming out, doesn't it? If you believe that lies, especially ones that tear families apart, eventually crumble under their own weight, hit that like button to support this story. In the comments, just write the word justice if you felt that moment of chilling satisfaction right along with me. Kevin finally stopped struggling. He pushed the nurse's hands away, his face a wreck of tears and self-loathing. Without another word, he turned and stumbled out of the room, shoving past his mother and sisters as if they were strangers. He fled down the sterile hospital hallway, away from the wreckage of his brother and the accusatory silence of his family. He burst out of the hospital's automatic doors and into the cold, damp air, gasping for breath he couldn't find. He got into his truck and drove, with no destination, no purpose, just a blind need to escape the man he had just discovered himself to be. He ended up by the banks of the Nisqually River, the water flowing dark and fast in the fading light. He slammed his fists on the steering wheel, again and again, until his knuckles were bruised and bleeding. Then he leaned his forehead against the cool plastic and screamed. It wasn't just a scream of regret. It was the howl of a man who had just realized he had personally, willingly, and cruelly demolished everything he had ever loved. And now he had to start a new war. The impossible war of trying to get it back. The news of the Morrison family's implosion didn't arrive with a triumphant bang, but with a quiet, hesitant phone call. It came from a mutual acquaintance, someone who still lived in the same town and had heard the story ripping through the local gossip mill. Claire took the call, her face growing more and more still as she listened. When she hung up, she came and sat across from me at our small kitchen table, her expression a mixture of shock and grim vindication. She relayed the story of what had happened in the hospital room. Nick's delirious confession, Kevin's violent outburst, the entire family turning on each other. I listened, absorbing the details, waiting for the feeling that was supposed to come. Relief? Triumph? A sense of sweet, satisfying justice. None of it came. Instead, a profound, bone-deep weariness settled over me. There was no joy in this victory, no satisfaction in their self-destruction. The truth was out, but the damage was done. The scars they'd left on me were real, and seeing them tear each other apart didn't magically make them disappear. I felt nothing but a heavy, tired certainty. I looked at Claire, my voice flat and devoid of emotion. They'll be coming here. She nodded, understanding immediately. Yes, they will. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the dark of the living room, watching the city lights twinkle below, my mind a churning sea of anxiety. For over a year, I'd been running, hiding, building a fragile peace. Now, the war was coming to find me. My first instinct, the soldier's instinct, was to pack a bag and run again. Disappear. Find a new city, a new state, a new life. But as I sat there, cradling a sleeping Henry in my arms, I knew that wasn't a solution. It was just a delay. I couldn't spend the rest of my son's life looking over my shoulder. Mindlessly scrolling on my phone, trying to distract myself, I stumbled upon a video on YouTube. It was a TED Talk by a researcher named Brené Brown. I'd heard her name before, but had never watched her work. The title was The Power of Vulnerability. I put in my earbuds and listened. She spoke about courage and shame and how we numb ourselves to avoid pain. And then she said a sentence that hit me with the force of a physical blow. She said, "Vulnerability is not weakness. It's our greatest measure of courage." Something inside me shifted. A fundamental tectonic plate of my understanding of strength. I had spent my entire adult life building walls, being strong, being invulnerable. I thought running, disappearing, and staying silent was strength. But I was wrong. I was just hiding. Real strength, I was beginning to understand, wasn't about running from the battle. It was about having the courage to stand your ground, face your fears, and say, clearly and calmly, "This is my boundary. You are not allowed to cross it." I didn't need to live in fear. Henry and I had a right to be safe. We had a right to peace, and I was the only one who could secure that perimeter. The next morning, when Claire came into the kitchen to make coffee, I was already awake, my mind clear and resolved for the first time in days. "I need a lawyer," I said. Claire just smiled, a look of immense pride on her face. "I know a good one." 2 days later, we were sitting in the sleek, downtown Portland office of a family law attorney named Sarah Chen. She was sharp, empathetic, and listened without interruption as I laid out the entire story, from the very first Thanksgiving to the phone call about Nick's confession. I presented the facts with the precision of a mission briefing, keeping my emotions in check, focusing on the sequence of events. When I finished, Sarah leaned back in her chair, her expression calm but firm. "Kira," she said, "what they did to you is horrific, but your instincts are correct. Now that the truth is out, they will likely come seeking forgiveness, or worse, demanding access to your son. They will frame it as their right as grandparents and as his father." The word father landed like a stone in the quiet office. "Our goal here is not revenge," Sarah continued, her voice becoming strategic. "Revenge is messy and emotionally draining. Our goal is protection. We are going to build a legal firewall around you and Henry. We will draft cease and desist letters. We will prepare restraining orders if necessary. We will make it legally, financially, and emotionally impossible for them to touch you." I felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me dizzy. I wasn't alone in this anymore. I had legal reinforcements. In the days that followed, Sarah and her team worked quickly, preparing the documents, creating a fortress of legal protection around my new life. But I knew the legal battle was only half of it. The other half was the mental preparation. The inevitable confrontation was coming, and I had to be ready. I spent my evenings, after Henry was asleep, rehearsing. But I wasn't practicing what I would say. I was practicing what I wouldn't say. I knew them. I knew their tactics. They would come with tears, with apologies, with dramatic declarations of regret. They would try to manipulate me, to guilt me, to draw me into an argument, to make this about their pain and their need for absolution. And I decided I would give them nothing. I wouldn't yell. I wouldn't cry. I wouldn't accuse. I wouldn't engage in their drama. My secret weapon, the most powerful tool in my arsenal, would be my silence, my calmness, my absolute refusal to let them make their problem my problem. I would not give them the fight they wanted. I would not give them the emotional release they craved. I had spent years feeling small and invisible in their presence. Now, I would use that invisibility as a shield, a boundary of quiet, unshakable strength. One afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table, the legal folder from Sarah's office lying in front of me. It was a tangible symbol of my new defenses, my firewall. Then, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. The caller ID was a number I didn't recognize, but the area code was 253. Washington. The area code for Fort Lewis, for Tacoma, for them. I let it ring, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. My heart began to pound, a steady military drumbeat. But it wasn't a beat of fear. It was a beat of readiness. I took a deep, steadying breath. The battle wasn't coming to find me anymore. I was going to let it come right to my front door. And this time, I was ready. The phone calls from Washington started 2 days after my meeting with the lawyer. I never answered. They went to voicemail, a series of increasingly desperate messages from Kevin, Nora, even Brittany. I deleted them all without listening. I knew what they would say, and their words had no power over me anymore. My preparation wasn't just legal, it was emotional. I was fortifying the perimeter of my own heart. Then, on a quiet Saturday afternoon, it happened. Henry, who was now a curious toddler, was playing with his blocks on the living room floor. I was watching him, a soft smile on my face, when a sharp, determined knock echoed from the front door. My heart didn't leap with fear. Instead, a strange, cold calm settled over me. I stood up, walked to the door, and looked through the peephole. It was Kevin. He looked wrecked. He seemed to have aged 10 years. His face was gaunt, his eyes were shadowed with exhaustion and something that looked like despair. He was no longer the handsome, confident man I had married. He was a ghost. Henry, hearing the knock, toddled over and wrapped his arms around my leg, looking up at me with curious blue eyes. His eyes. I took a breath. I unlatched the deadbolt, but I kept the chain lock firmly in place. I opened the door just a few inches, the brass chain straining between the door and the frame. Kevin's eyes, which had been fixed on the door, dropped. They landed on the small boy clinging to my leg. And in that instant, his face crumpled. He saw the dark hair. He saw his own eyes staring back at him from the face of a son he had never met. The reality of what he had thrown away hit him with the force of a physical blow. "Kira," he began, his voice a choked, broken whisper. I. He couldn't form the words. He just stared at Henry, his expression a ruin of shock and unbearable regret. I said nothing. I didn't need to. My silence was the only answer required. Henry, sensing a stranger's distress, tightened his grip on my leg and buried his face in my jeans. I looked at Kevin, at the man who had shattered my world, and I felt nothing. Not hatred, not pity, just a vast, empty distance. I calmly and quietly closed the door. The click of the latch was the only sound. The siege began the next day. He came back every single day for a week. He didn't knock again. He would just leave things at the door. A bouquet of expensive lilies, which I immediately threw in the dumpster. A long, handwritten letter in a sealed envelope, which I tore in half without reading and tossed after the flowers. A large, brightly colored toy truck for Henry, which I placed directly in the donation bin in our lobby. Each offering was a desperate attempt to buy his way back in, and each rejection was a silent reinforcement of my new boundary. One night, it started to rain, a heavy, relentless Portland downpour. Claire was out with friends, and Henry was asleep in his room. I was reading on the couch when I heard a sound from the hallway, a low, muffled sob. I muted the TV and listened. The sound was coming from right outside my door. I walked over and looked through the peephole again. Kevin was there, slumped against the opposite wall, his back to my door, his shoulders shaking. He was weeping. He started talking, his voice thick and broken, confessing to the wood of my door as if it were a priest. "I'm a coward, Kira," he choked out between sobs. "I was a coward. I listened to them. I wanted their approval more than I wanted to trust you. It was easier to believe them than to stand up to them. I'm so sorry. God, I am so sorry. Please, just give me one chance to make it right." I stood on my side of the door, my hand resting on the cool wood. I listened to the raw pain in his voice, to the sound of his heart breaking, and I waited for a feeling to surface. Pity? Forgiveness? A flicker of the old love? But there was nothing, just a cold, hollow emptiness. The part of me that had loved him, the part that would have ached to hear those words a year ago, was gone. It had died on that cold, wet lawn. Finally, I spoke. My voice was low, steady, and amplified by the resonant wood of the door. It was as cold and hard as steel. "The woman you knew died the night you spat in her face," I said, my words cutting through his sobs. "Sergeant Wallace is dead. Stop looking for her." There was a stunned silence from the hallway. Then, after a long moment, the sound of him slowly getting to his feet and walking away. The final assault came that weekend. This time, it was the whole platoon. I saw them on the new security camera I'd connected to my phone. Brittany, Nora, and Audrey, flanking a reluctant, shattered-looking Kevin. They were buzzing the apartment. I watched them on the screen, my heart beating a calm, steady rhythm. Brittany was dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, a performance of grief. Nora and Audrey looked impatient and angry, as if this were an inconvenience. I picked up my phone and sent a text to Claire, who was in the next room. "They're here. Can you handle this?" She texted back a single word: "Absolutely." I heard her open the apartment door, the chain still on, and speak through the crack. I couldn't hear her words, but I could imagine her tone, firm, unwavering, a brick wall of loyalty. After a minute, she closed and bolted the door, then came into the living room. "I relayed your message," she said quietly. Through the security camera, I had watched it all. I had seen Brittany's performative tears turn to frustrated rage. I had seen Nora start to yell at the camera, knowing I was watching. I had seen Kevin just stand there, a broken man being dragged along by the very people who had broken him. My message had been simple, delivered with Claire's unshakable calm. You humiliated me in public, so you can live with your regret in private. This door will never open for you. They finally gave up, turning and retreating in disarray down the hall. I watched their images disappear from my phone screen. I leaned my back against the door, the solid wood a comfort against my spine. I felt the adrenaline of the last week finally drain away, leaving me exhausted, but strangely, deeply peaceful. The door was closed. The firewall had held. But I knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a different kind of war. A war of boundaries and of the long, painful price of redemption. The aftermath of the confrontation was not loud, but quiet. After that final weekend, the calls and the visits stopped. The silence they left behind was vast and heavy, filled with unspoken things. My legal firewall had worked. They knew they couldn't breach it, but the war of boundaries, as I had predicted, had only just begun. It was now a cold war, fought not with confrontations, but with carefully worded emails from Kevin's lawyer to mine. His lawyer argued for visitation rights, for shared custody, for a chance for Kevin to be a father. My lawyer, Sarah, argued back, presenting the documented history of harassment, the forged DNA test, the public humiliation. But in the end, the decision came down to me. Sarah laid out the options. We could fight for full termination of parental rights, a long and ugly court battle, or we could define the terms of his existence in our lives ourselves. The thought of dragging Henry through a court system, of having his origins debated in a public forum, made me feel sick. There was another, more difficult truth I had to face. As much as I despised the man Kevin had become, he was still a part of Henry. My son had a right to know where he came from, to see the face of the man who gave him his blue eyes. To deny him that felt like a different kind of cruelty, a punishment that would land on my innocent son. So, I made a decision. It was not an act of forgiveness for Kevin. It was a gift of truth for Henry. I agreed to one meeting, one time only. It would be in a public place with Claire present as a neutral third party. No drama, no accusations. Just an introduction. We chose a busy, sunlit coffee shop in a neutral neighborhood. I picked a table near the window. Claire sat with me, a quiet, solid presence. I had a small bag of Henry's favorite toys to keep him occupied. When Kevin walked in, my breath caught for a second. He looked older, thinner. The easy confidence he once wore was gone, replaced by a deep, hollowed-out sadness. His eyes found us immediately. He walked over, his movements slow, almost hesitant, as if he were approaching a wild, easily startled animal. He didn't look at me. His entire being was focused on Henry, who was now standing by my chair, curiously watching the stranger approach. Kevin stopped at the table, his hands trembling slightly. He knelt down so his eyes were level with his son's. The resemblance was undeniable, a painful, beautiful echo. Henry, with the fearless innocence of a 2-year-old, tilted his head. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice clear as a bell. The question shattered what was left of Kevin's composure. His face crumpled. A tear traced a path down his cheek, and he struggled to speak, his voice thick with unshed grief. He started, then stopped, choking on the word, father he knew he had no right to claim. "I'm an old friend of your mom's." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, perfectly carved wooden bird. He held it out to Henry. My son looked at me for permission, and I gave a small nod. He took the bird, examined it for a moment, and then went back to playing with his toy cars, the man kneeling before him already forgotten. Kevin stayed for 10 more minutes. He didn't try to speak to me. He just watched his son, his face a canvas of love and loss and profound, unending regret. Then he stood up, gave me one long, haunted look, and walked out of the coffee shop. I never saw him in person again. The next week, Sarah sent his lawyer the final legal agreement. It was cold, precise, and absolute. Kevin would have no legal parental rights. His name would not be on the birth certificate. He would have no say in Henry's upbringing, his education, or his medical care. But he would not be erased completely. Once a year on Henry's birthday, He was permitted to send one gift, and in return I would send him one recent photograph of his son. He would not be Dad. He would not even be Uncle Kevin. He would be a stranger who once knew his mother, a distant, anonymous figure who sent a present every fall. It was the harshest mercy I could offer. It was our final boundary. Over the next few years, news of the Morrisons would trickle back to me through the grapevine of old acquaintances. Their journey of atonement was a quiet, public affair. I heard that Brittany had started volunteering at a shelter for battered women, spending her weekends listening to stories that must have sounded horribly familiar. Nora, whose words had always been weapons, had gone back to school for journalism and now wrote investigative pieces on family injustices for a small local paper. And Audrey, who had laughed at my pain, now worked as an aide for children with disabilities, dedicating her life to the vulnerable. I don't know if they did these things to earn my forgiveness. I suspect they did them because they couldn't live with themselves otherwise. Their punishments weren't handed down by a judge. They were self-imposed sentences, a lifetime of service to pay for a single, unforgivable hour. When Henry was about 5, old enough to ask the hard questions, he finally did. We were building a Lego spaceship on the living room floor one evening. He looked up at me, his expression serious. "Mom," he asked, "why don't I have a dad?" I stopped building and gave him my full attention. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 1,000 times. I had promised myself I would always be honest with him, in a way he could understand. I pulled him onto my lap. "You have a dad, sweetie," I said gently. "His name is Kevin." I explained that a dad is the man who helps make a baby. But being on a team is about more than just starting the game. It's about being there for your teammates, always. He looked at me, his brow furrowed, trying to understand. "A long time ago," I continued, choosing my words carefully, "your dad made a very big mistake. He believed a lie instead of believing in me. And because of that, he couldn't be on our team anymore." I hugged him close. "Our team needs to have 100% trust. Right, little warrior?" He nodded seriously, the military metaphor something his young mind could grasp. "Right, 100% trust." He accepted it, and we went back to building our spaceship. That night, after I tucked him into bed, I stood in his doorway, watching his small chest rise and fall in the soft glow of his rocket ship nightlight. The meeting, the legal papers, the quiet atonement of the Morrisons, none of it was for them. It was all for him. I had granted Kevin the smallest of concessions, not for his sake, but for my son's. Henry has a right to know his history, but he also has a right to be protected from its fallout. And that, I realized, would be my legacy. Not the anger, not the pain, but the fierce, unending mission of building a world that was safe for him. And, I thought, for others, just like me. The thought that took root in my mind that night, watching my son sleep, was not about the past. It was about the future. It was the realization that my mission wasn't just about protecting my own son, but about helping others who had found themselves on a similar battlefield. My war was over, but for so many others, it was just beginning. That realization was the seed from which silent strength was born. It started small, in Claire's living room, with a pot of coffee and a handful of women. Claire, with her fierce loyalty and organizational genius, became my co-founder. We reached out through veteran networks and military spouse forums, looking for women who, like me, had faced betrayal from within their own ranks, within their own homes. We made a conscious decision not to call it a therapy group. These women didn't need therapy. They needed strategy. They didn't need pity. They needed a plan. So we called it the Regroup Unit. It was a place where women could come not to relive their trauma, but to rearm themselves for the future. We took the principles of military strategy and applied them to civilian life. We taught them about establishing legal defense perimeters, getting lawyers, filing the right paperwork. We ran workshops on logistics, which meant securing financial independence, building credit, and finding jobs. And most importantly, we helped them build alliances, a network of other women who understood, who could offer a spare room, babysit during a court date, or just listen without judgment. We were a unit, watching each other's backs. My own life, outside of the group, found a new, beautiful simplicity. My logistics job was steady and satisfying. It was quiet, predictable work that used the skills the Army had given me, but allowed me to be home every night to tuck Henry into bed. Our weekends were spent exploring the breathtaking beauty of Oregon. We'd go hiking on the trails of Forest Park or drive out to the majestic Columbia River Gorge. I taught Henry how to read a compass, how to identify different types of trees, how to persevere when the trail got steep. I was teaching him about resilience, not through words, but by walking beside him. Our small apartment was no longer a fortress against the world, but a warm, welcoming base camp, always filled with the laughter of friends, our chosen family. News about the Morrisons became a distant, fading echo. I heard through a friend of a friend that Nick, after recovering, had moved to a different state, somewhere in the Midwest. He lived a quiet, solitary life, estranged from the very family he had tried to manipulate. His punishment wasn't a prison sentence, it was a lifetime of invisibility. And Kevin, he never remarried. The once-a-year package for Henry would arrive like clockwork, always something thoughtful and well-made. And once a year, I would send back a single professional school photograph. Our communication was a sterile, silent exchange through the mail. From what I heard, he lived with a quiet, ever-present regret. A ghost in the life he was supposed to have. I didn't hate him anymore. I simply didn't think of him at all. The work with the regroup unit grew. Our small living room group expanded into a recognized nonprofit. It turned out there were so many women who needed a new unit, a new mission. The story of our group spread through the veteran community, a quiet testament to the power of rebuilding. A few years ago, I was invited to be a keynote speaker at a national conference for women in the military. As I stood backstage, looking out at the crowd of hundreds of women in uniform, I felt a tremor of the old fear. But then I looked down at the speech I had written, and I remembered who I was now. I walked onto that stage not as a victim, but as a commander. I told my story. I told them about the betrayal, the humiliation, and the long road back. I told them that their training had prepared them for more than just the battlefield. It had prepared them for life. It had given them discipline, strategy, and the unbreakable spirit to rebuild from nothing. The story culminates here, not on a national stage, but back where it all began. In a quiet room, with a circle of women. Last week, at our weekly regroup meeting, a new member joined us. She was a young Air Force captain, her uniform immaculate, but her eyes were red-rimmed and filled with a pain I recognized instantly. She told her story, her voice cracking as she spoke of her husband's betrayal, of being cast aside by his family. The other women in the circle listened, nodding with a quiet, profound understanding. There were no platitudes, no empty reassurances, just a shared, silent acknowledgement of her pain. When she finished, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs, I walked over to her. I didn't hug her. It wasn't time for that yet. Instead, I placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder, the way a senior NCO does to a new recruit. I looked her directly in the eye, and my voice was calm, clear, and filled with the absolute certainty of a truth I'd earned. "Welcome to the unit," I said. "We don't scream here, we strategize, we don't crumble, we build." I gave her shoulder a slight squeeze. "Your mission, starting now, is to build a life so good, so strong, and so full of peace that your past has no choice but to stand down and salute." That is my story. It wasn't an easy mission, but it's the one that finally brought me home. Not to a place, but to myself. My story is over. But I know for many of you, your own battles are still ongoing. Remember that you are the commanding officer of your own life. You have the strength, the strategy, and the right to build your own fortress of peace. If Kira's journey resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these stories reach others who might need to hear them. Thank you for listening.